Okay, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna disputing what some environment ministers were saying yesterday about the carbon tax surprise. They were saying it was sort of sprung on them at this meeting. All right, let's move along. They're all bubbly, and I guess you could call them carbonized over yesterday's big announcement. Our MPs are here to dissect the climate change plan and look at today's vigil on murdered and missing Aboriginal women. Joining us, Marco Mendicino is a Liberal MP from Toronto. Shannon Stubbs is a Conservative MP from Lakeland, Alberta. Nikki Ashton, an NDP MP from Northern Manitoba. Welcome to you all. Let's quickly talk about this. I mean, I don't know if anyone here thinks that Canada could really escape a carbon price. Can they, Shannon, of some kind, a carbon pricing mechanism?
Well, the vast majority of provinces and territories in Canada were already taking various approaches to carbon taxing and pricing and levies and cap and trade, reflective of their own unique economies and in the best interest of their own citizens. So the federal government promised negotiations with provinces and territories, as well as a debate in the House of Commons for federal representatives from around the country to have their say on a carbon tax. They didn't deliver on any of that, but instead unilaterally imposed a massive tax hike, which by 2022, I note after the next federal election, is estimated to cost Canadian families more than $2,500 a year. So I think it's clear from provincial and territorial leaders, even of the same political stripe, that they feel very blindsided by the federal Liberals, and they are speaking the truth, which is that this wasn't a negotiation at all. It's a one-size-fits-all, Ottawa knows best tax hike on all Canadians.
Okay. I'm going to stick with you, though, because I want to know what the Conservative plan is. I mean, you got to price carbon in some way, shape, or form. What would the Conservatives do to meet those targets, which, by the way, the Harper targets are still the Liberal targets?
Under the previous Conservative government, overall emissions in Canada declined while the economy grew and while jobs were created. So the previous Conservative government already proved that you can
province of Ontario
reduce Canadian emissions overall while growing the economy. So this was before a carbon tax, a federal carbon tax. It clearly wasn't necessary to reduce emissions for Canada overall. But part of the reason of why this is such an important discussion is that it goes to Canada's competitiveness globally. Right. And so if this carbon tax is being discussed in the context of international agreements, then it makes no sense whatsoever for the Canadian government to proceed down this road that neither the U.S. nor any of the other top 6 major oil and gas producing countries in the world are proposing or implementing. And the reason they're not imposing it is because it will be detrimental to their competitiveness, bad for their economies, and bad for their citizens.
You guys are the question. Nikki, NDP support a carbon price, obviously, but where do you go to? I mean, without hurting the economy, what would the NDP do differently than this one that's proposed by Justin Trudeau?
Well, a couple things. I mean, first of all, we find the announcement to be unambitious. I mean, we've known for some time that the Liberals' carbon targets are the same as Harper's. That's not what Canadians voted for when they voted for real change. We also feel that there's a number of unanswered questions in terms of how this carbon pricing will actually work, questions that have yet to be answered. And obviously, we're also very concerned about the kind of frustration that we saw from provinces, whether it's from Alberta or other provinces, obviously made clear in very overt ways, and owing to the fact that a number of key questions remain unanswered.
Okay, Marco, how do you plead on all this?
I plead what you heard from Minister McKenna very articulately, which is that we need a cleaner, more innovative economy. The way that you do that is to set a benchmark price on carbon pollution. We've done that, as Shannon rightly points out. 80% of the Canadian population is already subject to such a pricing. So this is really about partnering up with our federal provincial provinces, I beg your pardon. And I would take some issue with the characterization that we haven't delivered on that front. Prime Minister and Minister McKenna brought and invited all of the provincial premiers to come to COP21. Following that, we also had the Vancouver Declaration, where there was consensus about moving in this very direction. So the science is pretty clear. Anybody that still denies climate change, I think, needs to get with the times. And this is about ensuring that we have a planet to give our children.
Yeah, but to Shannon's point, though, I mean, you set up a working group to consult with the environment ministers across the country, and they sort of show up at this convention yesterday to talk about their findings, and then bang, Justin Trudeau drops the numbers on them right out of the blue. Don't they have a reason to be a little miffed?
I don't think so. I think that even the premiers would have to concede that there has been a long, ongoing dialogue since we were elected, since COP21, going right through the Vancouver Declaration. Everybody has been on the same page about the fact that there needs to be a price on carbon pollution. But at the same time, we're going to be flexible. And as Minister McKenna explained, we will leave it up to provinces to determine whether or not they want to put a direct price or whether or not they want to use the cap and trade. And there have been success stories along the latter front, certainly in BC. And I want to underline that it will be net neutral to the provinces. So whatever revenues the federal government generates as a result of putting a price on carbon pollution will be put right back into the provinces, and that's a positive thing because it's about ensuring that we get the right balance between protecting the environment and driving the economy.
You look like you're having a little cardiac distress when he was saying everyone thinks the carbon tax is a good idea.
Well,
I didn't say carbon tax, I said a price on carbon pollution.
All three territorial leaders were unequivocal and very clear about their opposition to a carbon tax.
Nova Scotia said today, by the way,
Nova Scotia
we will not implement a carbon tax.
Right, and Newfoundland is now is also criticizing the federal government's approach. I think the Premier of Saskatchewan has been very clear about his opposition to a carbon tax, and so it's just not the case at all that there is consensus among provincial and territorial leaders about a carbon tax or carbon pricing, or whether or not it's the
I want to stick with you on one thing, though, if I don't mind. I mean, a lot of the heavy lifting on getting those emissions down to the level you were talking about were done by the provinces, particularly Ontario for getting rid of coal-fired power plants, phasing them out. How do you get from here to your targets when they've done that work without putting a price on carbon, without discouraging or trying to encourage people to reduce their emissions? How do you get there?
Well, the previous government was taking a sector-by-sector regulatory approach, so balancing economic growth with reducing emissions. The proof is in the pudding there, because Canada's emissions overall did decline under the previous government, and investing in technology and in innovation, and reducing the fiscal burden on private sectors and investors so that they can invest in technology and innovation. Because, of course, the fact is that in terms of conventional and unconventional oil and gas developers, for example, they are generally the very same developers who will lead on the front line of alternative and renewable energy technologies into the future.
Okay, Nikki,
but the very worst possible thing to do is to undermine the investment environment and raise taxes and costs on every single Canadian in all communities and every business to make things worse.
Quick. No, actually, I want to move on, because I think you've got something to say about this. There was a vigil today, murdered and missing Aboriginal women. The Prime Minister spoke at that, but there's some frustration I sense that it's going too slowly. And here's a clip from Patty Hajdu, who's the Status of Women Minister. Here's what she had to say about that.
I understand that families may be frustrated that they're not seeing this unfold very quickly, but consultation has a 2-year time frame to come back with actions and recommendations that they believe that all of us should take to protect women and girls. In the meantime, as I said, we're taking concrete action through the federal gender-based violence strategy that will happen much more quickly than waiting for those resolutions and actions.
Yeah, Nikki, the Commission's been up and appointed for a couple of months now. They put out a release today saying, well, we're hiring some staff and trying to find offices and finding ways to fulfill our mandate. Is it going too slow in your view?
I mean, the Commission's doing the work that they've been asked to do, and that's very important work. But, I mean, certainly the Minister's statement today is just not good enough. I mean, the government concurrently could be taking immediate actions to address the conditions of vulnerability that Indigenous women face. I know at home, representing 41 First Nations, people talk about how housing is part of that vulnerability, how lack of access to education, how issues around policing or lack of access to shelters. I mean, these are all pieces that we don't need an inquiry to tell us that need to be dealt with. The government could be stepping up, and they're simply not doing so. I mean, we were up in the House today talking about the fact that they're still going to court over appropriate funding for, or equal funding for First Nations youth. They're still totally certainly not stepping up in terms of housing funding. And so the reality is that the federal government could be doing so much more while the Commission is doing its work. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada.
Right, Marco, your thoughts?
Well, I think we have to begin by understanding that the relationship is very important, and I say that along with the Prime Minister and Minister Haidu and Minister Bennett and every member of our caucus, and I think we're all united on that. And it really does involve listening to people, and certainly throughout the course of setting up this inquiry, there was a lot of emphasis placed on consultations so that we could include the community in setting up the framework for the inquiry, and that is obviously inclusive of the 5 commissioners who are now serving on it. Do we want to move things along? Absolutely we do, and you heard Minister Haidu say that. But to suggest, as Nikki has, that the federal government has not stepped up, when in Budget 2016, we allocated $8.3 billion over the next 5 years, which is historic in its rates, including on the very important issue of housing, where there was $2.2 billion over the next 2 years. But those are historic amounts.
Okay, fair enough.
Those are
I'm
historic
out of time,
amounts.
So you've got to be very, very brief. What's your thoughts on this?
I think what Canadians will want to see is action, not a report that sits on a shelf or in a computer joining the 40 other studies, actual reduction in violence and harm against First Nations women.
That was good. Very good. Thank you, Shannon. All right. Thank you all. We'll see you next week, I guess.
Thanks, Don.